The auction ledger from Galveston's Strand District, housed within the Rosenberg Library archives, contains an entry that remains a subject of debate among historians. Dated December 7, 1859, Lot 43 concerns a male, approximately 32 years of age, origin unknown. Written in faded ink by an auctioneer named William Marsh, the subsequent notation states, highest bid withdrawn, sale completed under protest. Buyer warned of documented anomalies, pricey 400, significantly below market value for prime age male. What rendered this entry truly extraordinary was not the remarkably low price, though that alone prompted questions. It was the 17-page attachment appended to it, a collection of testimonies from 3 previous owners, 2 ship captains, a Methodist minister, and a Texas Ranger, all describing the same seemingly impossible phenomenon. The man they were selling could read and write in 7 languages, perform complex mathematical calculations in moments that took trained engineers hours to complete, recite entire books verbatim after a single hearing, and demonstrate knowledge of astronomy, navigation, medicine, and law that rivaled university professors. In 1859 Texas, such abilities in an enslaved man were not merely unusual. According to every witness who'd encountered him, they were considered impossible. Before we uncover how this man's intelligence became the most dangerous secret in Galveston, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, the ones that challenge everything we thought we knew about American history, are exactly what we uncover here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, as these buried stories deserve to reach every corner of the world. Now, let's discover why Galveston's wealthiest plantation owners called this slave the most terrifying purchase they'd ever witnessed. Not because of his strength or defiance, but because of what existed inside his mind. William Marsh had conducted slave auctions in Galveston for 11 years. The Strand, as locals called the warehouse district along the Gulf waterfront, handled thousands of transactions annually, making Galveston second only to New Orleans in the Texas slave trade. Marsh prided himself on knowing his merchandise, assessing worth with a glance, and understanding exactly what buyers wanted and how to present it. He'd sold field hands, domestic servants, skilled craftsmen, and children, each transaction documented with the same professional detachment that marked all commerce in human beings during that era. But on the morning of December 7th, 1859, Marsh stood in his office holding documents that made his hands shake. The man scheduled for Lot 43 had arrived 3 days earlier on a steamship from New Orleans, accompanied by paperwork unlike anything Marsh had seen in his career. The seller, a cotton broker named Hastings who operated between Louisiana and Texas, had included written warnings from every person who'd previously owned or transported this particular slave. The testimonies read like fevered fantasies, claims so extraordinary that Marsh's first instinct was to dismiss them as elaborate fraud. Then he'd met the man himself, and everything changed. His name in the auction catalog was listed simply as Solomon, though the paperwork suggested this might be the 4th or 5th name he'd been given. No surname, no clear origin. Just Solomon, male, age estimated between 30 and 35 based on physical examination. He stood 5'11", tall, well-muscled but not excessively so, with hands that showed calluses from field work, but also the careful maintenance of someone who valued his physical condition. His face carried no distinguishing scars, no marks of punishment or rebellion. What distinguished him was something far more subtle and infinitely more unsettling. His eyes held an awareness that made Marsh deeply uncomfortable. Most enslaved people who came through Galveston's auction houses had learned to manage their expressions carefully. Some showed resignation, others carefully concealed anger, and many displayed the practiced blankness that came from years of surveillance and punishment. Solomon showed none of these things. When Marsh interviewed him in the holding area, preparing the standard assessment for potential buyers, Solomon had looked at him with calm, direct attention and answered every question in perfect English, his vocabulary and pronunciation matching any educated gentleman Marsh had ever encountered. "Where were you born?" Marsh had asked, following his usual script. "I don't know, sir," Solomon replied, his voice carrying neither defiance nor servility, just a simple statement of fact. "My earliest memories are of a plantation in Virginia, but I was told I came from elsewhere originally. No one seemed certain of the details. Can you read?" A slight pause, then, "Yes, sir." "How did you learn?" "I taught myself, sir. By observing letters and words, understanding patterns, practicing when I could." Marsh had set down his pen at that point, studying Solomon more carefully. Self-taught literacy among slaves was rare and dangerous. Most plantation owners forbade education explicitly, understanding that literacy opened doors to ideas, to resistance, to hope. "The paperwork I received about you contained some unusual claims," Marsh said, choosing his words carefully. "Claims about your abilities that seem frankly impossible. I need to understand what's true and what's exaggeration before I can sell you honestly." "What do the papers claim?" "Sir, that you speak multiple languages, that you can perform complex mathematics, that you've demonstrated knowledge of subjects no slave should have access to, that you've made predictions about events that later proved accurate, that you've solved problems experienced overseers and plantation managers couldn't solve." Marsh leaned forward. "Are these claims true?" Solomon met his gaze with that unsettling directness. "I can speak French, Spanish, German, Latin, and some Greek in addition to English, sir. I can perform calculations involving multiplication, division, fractions, and basic algebra. I have studied through observation and limited access to book subjects including astronomy, navigation, human anatomy, agricultural science, and law. As for predictions, I have sometimes noticed patterns others missed and mentioned what might follow from those patterns. Whether that constitutes prediction, I cannot say." The calm, precise way he delivered this information, as though describing the weather, made Marsh's throat go dry. "How?" he'd ask. "How is any of that possible?" "I remember everything I see or hear, sir," Solomon said simply. "Every conversation, every word in every book I've glimpsed, every calculation I've observed someone else perform. My mind holds information the way a ledger holds numbers. I cannot explain why this is true. I only know it has been true for as long as I can remember." Marsh ended the interview shortly after, needing time to process what he'd heard. He spent the next 2 days reading through the testimonies, and each one confirmed what Solomon had described, often with additional details that made the phenomenon even more inexplicable. The first testimony came from a Virginia plantation owner named Carlisle, who'd purchased Solomon at a Richmond auction in 1854. Carlisle's letter, written to the broker who'd later sold Solomon, explained what had happened during the 16 months Solomon lived on his tobacco plantation. "I bought him as a field hand," Carlisle wrote. "Strong, healthy, no obvious defects. I assigned him to my crew working the tobacco harvest. Within 3 days, my overseer reported something unusual. Solomon had observed the other workers for perhaps 6 hours total, then began working with an efficiency that exceeded men who'd been doing the job for 20 years. He wasted no motion, damaged no leaves, completed rows faster than anyone else while maintaining higher quality." The letter continued, "I dismissed this as simple aptitude until my overseer mentioned that Solomon had corrected him about the timing of the harvest. We'd planned to cut a particular field on Thursday, Solomon quietly suggested, when asked his opinion, that waiting until Saturday would yield better results based on weather patterns he'd observed and the moisture content of the leaves. My overseer, irritated at being questioned by a slave, dismissed the advice. Thursday's harvest went poorly due to unexpected humidity. Saturday's weather was perfect, exactly as Solomon had predicted. Carlisle's letter grew more detailed from there. Within 6 weeks, Solomon had demonstrated knowledge of crop rotation, soil enrichment, pest management, and harvesting techniques that matched information in agricultural journals Carlisle subscribed to. When questioned, Solomon explained he'd glimpsed those journals briefly when delivering firewood to Carlisle's study and had memorized their contents. I tested this claim, Carlisle wrote. I showed him a page from a journal on tobacco cultivation, let him look at it for perhaps 30 seconds, then took it away and asked him to recite what he'd read. He repeated the entire page word for word, including the footnotes and citations. I showed him a mathematical table used for calculating yield projections. He glanced at it, then performed calculations in his head faster than I could using pencil and paper, and his answers were correct every time. The letter's conclusion explained why Carlisle had sold Solomon despite his obvious value. I could not keep him. The other slaves began looking to him for guidance, asking his advice, treating him with deference that undermined my overseer's authority. Worse, Solomon's knowledge made him dangerous. He understood too much about laws, about property rights, about navigation and geography. He could read contracts better than my lawyer. He corrected my doctor's diagnosis of a field hand's illness and suggested a treatment that proved effective. I realized I was housing someone whose intelligence exceeded my own, who understood systems and patterns I could barely grasp, and who remained enslaved only because of the color of his skin and the legal structures that supported that enslavement. The situation felt increasingly unstable. I sold him to a cotton broker in New Orleans for a substantial profit, though I suspect I should have warned the buyer more explicitly about what he was acquiring. The second testimony came from that cotton broker, a man named Reynolds, who'd owned Solomon for only 8 weeks before reselling him. Reynolds's letter was shorter, but more agitated in tone. Carlisle told me Solomon was unusually intelligent. Reynolds wrote, I assumed he meant clever, perhaps cunning in the way some slaves learn to manipulate situations to their advantage. I did not understand what Carlisle actually meant until Solomon had been in my household for 3 days. I employed him as a general laborer, but he spent time near my office where I conducted business. One evening, he quietly mentioned that I was making an error in my accounting, that the numbers I'd recorded for a recent cotton shipment didn't match the weights I'd been given. I checked my figures. He was correct. I'd transposed 2 numbers in a calculation involving several thousand. Reynolds's letter described increasing discomfort as Solomon's abilities became more apparent. He speaks French better than my wife, who studied it in finishing school. He can calculate exchange rates between currencies faster than my banker. He mentioned once in passing that a particular ship I was considering for transport had structural weaknesses in its hull, based on how it sat in the water, and suggested I choose a different vessel. I dismissed this as presumption, but later learned the ship had developed leaks during its voyage and barely made port. How did he know? He claimed he'd observed the ship's waterline and understood from that observation what it meant about the vessel's construction and loading. The letter concluded, I sold him because I found myself unconsciously beginning to defer to his judgment. I would catch myself asking his opinion before making business decisions. This is intolerable. A man cannot function as a merchant when his slave understands commerce better than he does. I sold him to a trader heading to Texas, hoping distance would end my discomfort. I provided documentation about his abilities because I felt the buyer deserved to know what he was purchasing. Though I'm not certain anyone could truly prepare for the experience of owning someone like Solomon. The third testimony came from the captain of the steamship that had transported Solomon from New Orleans to Galveston. Captain Morrison's account was the most disturbing. Solomon was kept below deck with other cargo during most of the voyage. Morrison wrote, "On the second day, we encountered navigation difficulties. A storm had shifted our course, and my navigator was struggling to determine our exact position using celestial observations. The mathematics were complex, involving multiple calculations to account for drift and current. We were debating our position when Solomon, who'd been sitting quietly nearby in chains, spoke up. He said, based on what he'd heard of our observations and the time elapsed since the storm, that we were approximately 18 miles southeast of our intended position. My navigator dismissed this as impossible given the complexity of the calculation. We completed our own calculations over the next hour and determined our position. Solomon had been correct to within 3 miles, despite having no instruments, no charts, and no formal training in navigation." Morrison's letter continued. I questioned him extensively after that incident. He explained that he'd learned navigation by observing sailors during previous transports, that he'd memorized celestial tables after glimpsing them briefly, and that he could perform the necessary calculations mentally. To test this, I gave him complex mathematical problems, typically requiring written work. He solved them instantly, showing me the steps mentally in a way that suggested he was reading the calculations from some internal ledger. I've sailed for 30 years and encountered many educated men. Solomon's abilities exceeded all of them. By the time we reached Galveston, I was thoroughly unsettled. A man with his intelligence should not exist in chains. And yet there he was, legally property, headed to auction like livestock. Marsh had read these testimonies multiple times, each reading making him more certain of one thing. Solomon would be nearly impossible to sell. Most buyers wanted workers who were strong, obedient, and simple. Intelligence in a slave made owners nervous, created management problems, and suggested potential for rebellion or escape. Extraordinary intelligence, the kind Solomon apparently possessed, would be absolutely terrifying to anyone who understood its implications. He'd called in his business partner, a slave trader named Hawkins, who had more experience with unusual cases. They discussed the situation over whiskey in Marsh's office, trying to determine how to handle the sale. "You could just lie," Hawkins said. "Don't mention the paperwork. Sell him as a standard field hand and let the buyer discover the truth later." "That's fraud," Marsh replied. "And it's dangerous. If his abilities become apparent and the buyer learns I knew and didn't disclose, I'll lose every client I have. Reputation matters in this business. Then disclose everything and accept that you'll get a fraction of his worth. Most planters won't touch him once they understand what they're buying." "Why not?" "He's valuable. His skills could improve any operation." Hawkins gave him a pitying look. "Because he's too valuable. William, a slave who can outthink his master, who understands systems better than the people controlling those systems, who can predict outcomes and solve problems at a level that exceeds trained professionals. That's not a worker. That's a threat to the entire structure. You think plantation owners want their slaves to realize how arbitrary their enslavement is? You think they want someone around who can explain property law, calculate exact distances to free states, Speak multiple languages for communicating with potential allies, and remember every detail of every conversation he overhears. Solomon isn't just intelligent, he's dangerously intelligent, and everyone who's owned him has realized that eventually. The conversation ended with Marsh accepting that Solomon would sell below value to whoever was willing to accept the risk. He'd prepared the auction listing with full disclosure, attaching all the testimonies, and adding his own summary of what he'd observed during his interview with Solomon. The description ended with a warning he'd never used before. Buyer assumes full responsibility for management of unusual capabilities. No refunds or exchanges will be offered regardless of subsequent difficulties. The auction itself began normally enough. December 7th dawned clear and cool, typical weather for Galveston's mild winters. The Strand was busy with merchants, sailors, and planters in town for business. Marsh's auction house filled with the usual crowd of buyers. Men from plantations scattered across Texas, looking for workers to expand their operations or replace those who'd been sold, died, or escaped. The morning proceeded through the first 42 lots without incident. Men and women stood on the platform, were examined, questioned, and sold to the highest bidders. Prices ran normal for the season. Prime male field hands sold for between $900 and $200, women slightly less, children priced according to age and potential. Then Marsh called Lot 43. Two handlers brought Solomon onto the platform. He walked without resistance, his movements controlled and deliberate. He wore simple work clothes, reasonably clean, and his physical condition was excellent. Under normal circumstances, he would have drawn aggressive bidding, strong, healthy, prime working age, no visible defects. But Marsh had distributed copies of the testimonies that morning to serious buyers, and the atmosphere in the auction house had changed as men rayed through the documents. By the time Solomon stood on the platform, most buyers had moved toward the back of the room or left entirely. Only 7 remained in bidding position, and 4 of them looked uncertain. Lot 43, Marsh announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm that sounded increasingly hollow even to himself. Male, approximately 32 years of age, excellent physical condition, experienced in field work and general labor. He paused, then added the required disclosure. As noted in the documentation provided this morning, this lot demonstrates unusual intellectual capabilities. All buyers have been informed of these capabilities and associated testimonies. Special terms apply. All sales are final regardless of subsequent management difficulties. A murmur ran through the remaining crowd. One man near the front turned and walked out immediately. Another followed. That left 5 potential buyers. Solomon stood at the center of the platform, his expression calm, his posture neither defiant nor submissive. Just still. His eyes moved across the crowd with what appeared to be mild interest, as though he were observing a theater performance that didn't particularly concern him. "Let's begin at 600s, Marsh said, setting the opening bid lower than he would for a standard worker, acknowledging the risk buyers would be taking. Silence. None of the 5 raised a hand. 500s, Marsh tried, dropping the price to a level that should have seemed like theft for someone of Solomon's apparent value. More silence. One of the remaining buyers shook his head and moved toward the exit. 400s, Marsh said, now genuinely desperate. "Gentlemen, at this price, you're essentially buying him at half his physical value alone, completely aside from his other capabilities." A hand went up at the back of the room. Marsh felt relief wash over him. "We have 400 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 450? The other 3 remaining buyers exchanged glances, but none raised a hand. They were done. 400 going once, 400 going twice. Marsh's gavel came down. "Sold to Mr. James Blackwood of Oleander Plantation for 400 dive." The transaction completed within the hour. Blackwood, a wealthy planter who owned 6,000 acres of cotton land 30 miles inland from Galveston, signed the purchase documents without expression. When Marsh offered him the attached testimonies one final time, Blackwood waved them away. "I've read them," he said. "I understand what I'm buying." "Then you understand the risks." "I understand that someone extraordinarily valuable is being sold at a fraction of his worth, because other men lack the nerve to handle unusual circumstances. I've built my fortune by recognizing opportunities others miss. This man's intelligence isn't a problem. It's an asset if managed correctly." Marsh had wanted to warn him further, to explain that 3 separate owners had all reached the same conclusion, that Solomon was ultimately unsustainable. But Blackwood's confidence was absolute. He arranged transport and departed with Solomon in a wagon heading inland, the most intelligent slave ever sold in Galveston, leaving the auction house in chains, while his new owner smiled with satisfaction at the bargain he'd secured. Marsh watched them go from his office window, feeling an unease he couldn't quite name. He'd sold thousands of human beings in his career, each transaction documented with professional detachment. But something about this sale felt different. Felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the usual wrongness of the slave trade itself. He returned to his desk and wrote a brief note in his personal journal, a practice he maintained separate from official business records. December 7th, 1859, sold lot 43, the slave called Solomon, to James Blackwood for $400, lowest price I've received for a prime-age male in 5 years. Blackwood was pleased with his purchase. I cannot shake the feeling he shouldn't be. Time will tell. Time would indeed tell. Though the answer would come faster than anyone expected, and would prove far more extraordinary than even the testimonies had suggested. Oleander Plantation sprawled across 6,000 acres of Texas coastal prairie, its fields stretching in geometric precision under the enormous sky that characterized the region. James Blackwood had built the operation over 15 years, starting with 800 acres inherited from his father and expanding through careful acquisition and aggressive management. By 1859, Oleander supported 143 enslaved workers, produced over 400 bales of cotton annually, and generated profits that made Blackwood one of the wealthiest planters in the region. He'd achieved this success through systematic efficiency. Unlike some plantation owners who relied on excessive violence or chaotic management, Blackwood operated with precision. He employed 3 overseers who reported directly to him, maintained detailed records of every aspect of plantation operations, and prided himself on understanding his business better than any competitor. His wealth came from knowledge, from seeing patterns in markets, from optimizing every element of production. He believed intelligence was the key to success, and he had absolute confidence in his own intellectual superiority. That confidence made him uniquely unsuited to understand what he'd purchased in Solomon. The wagon carrying them from Galveston reached Oleander on the evening of December 7th. Blackwood had spent the journey in silence, reviewing paperwork and occasionally glancing at Solomon, who sat motionless in the wagon bed, his expression revealing nothing. When they arrived, Blackwood called for his head overseer, a methodical man from Georgia named Porter, who'd worked at Oleander for 8 years. "This is Solomon," Blackwood said. "Assign him to the main house work crew initially. I want him close where I can observe him. Feed him properly. See that he's housed adequately. He's not to be worked like a field hand until I've assessed his capabilities." Porter studied Solomon with practiced assessment, noting his physical condition, his bearing, the unusual directness in his eyes. "Any special instructions, sir?" "Watch him carefully. Report everything unusual. And Porter, Make certain the other workers understand he's not to be mistreated. He represents a significant investment, and I want him maintained in optimal condition. After Porter led Solomon away to assign him quarters, Blackwood retreated to his study and poured himself whiskey. He felt the satisfaction of a man who'd identified opportunity where others saw only risk. The testimonies about Solomon's abilities, rather than frightening him, had excited his competitive instincts. If this man could truly calculate faster than trained engineers, understand complex systems after brief exposure, and demonstrate knowledge that exceeded educated professionals, then he represented unprecedented value. Other owners had failed to capitalize on Solomon's intelligence because they'd been afraid of it. Blackwood intended to harness it. The first week passed uneventfully. Solomon worked alongside the main house crew, performing routine maintenance tasks, chopping firewood, assisting with repairs. Porter reported that Solomon worked steadily, never complained, followed every instruction immediately, and kept to himself during the limited free time workers were allowed in the evenings. He spoke only when addressed, answered questions politely, and showed no interest in socializing with other enslaved people at Oleander. He's quiet, Porter told Blackwood on the 5th day. Observant, though. I catch him watching how things work, studying the other workers, looking at the plantation like he's reading a book. It's not threatening exactly, but it's noticeable. That's his nature, Blackwood said. The documentation indicated he absorbs information constantly. Let him observe. I want to understand the full extent of his capabilities before I determine how to utilize him most effectively. On the 8th day, Blackwood decided to test what the testimonies had claimed. He called Solomon to his study after breakfast, a room lined with books on agriculture, law, history, and science. Solomon entered and stood near the door, waiting with that same calm attentiveness that characterized all his actions. The men who sold you made extraordinary claims. Blackwood began, seating himself behind his desk while Solomon remained standing. I've read testimonies suggesting you can perform complex calculations mentally, that you speak multiple languages, that you remember everything you encounter. Before I can properly utilize your abilities, I need to verify these claims personally. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Solomon said, his voice carrying neither pride nor defensiveness. Blackwood pulled out a sheet of paper covered in numbers. This is a calculation I performed yesterday for projecting cotton yields, based on current field conditions. It took me approximately 30 minutes using standard methods. I'll read you the variables, and I want you to perform the calculation mentally. You'll have no paper, no tools, just what you can do in your head. Can you do this? I can try, sir. Blackwood read through a series of numbers. Acreage planted, estimated yield per acre, based on soil quality and rainfall, projected market prices, costs of labor and materials, transportation expenses. The calculation required multiple steps of multiplication, division, and subtraction to arrive at a profit estimate. He finished reading the variables and looked up at Solomon. Well, the projected profit is 4th of 273.42, sir, Solomon said immediately, assuming current market prices hold and no unexpected crop loss occurs. Blackwood felt his breath catch. He looked down at his own calculation, checked the final figure he'd arrived at after 30 minutes of careful work. 4,273.2 exactly. How did you do that so quickly? I held each number as you said it, sir, then performed the operations in sequence. My mind arranges the figures visually, and I can manipulate them the way one might move objects on a desk. I cannot explain the mechanism, only that it has always worked this way. The Blackwood set down the paper, his hands less steady than they'd been moments before. The testimonies mentioned you speak multiple languages. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. French, Spanish, German, Latin, and some Greek in addition to English. Where did you learn them? Different sources, sir. I heard French spoken by a previous owner's wife. Spanish from Mexican laborers I worked alongside briefly. German from a book I glimpsed for perhaps 20 minutes in a study. Latin and Greek from religious texts and classical works I've had limited access to over the years. Once I understand the structure of a language and a sufficient vocabulary, I can extrapolate the rest through pattern recognition. This was absurd. Languages required years of study, immersion, practice. Yet Solomon spoke with the same calm certainty he'd used when solving the mathematical problem. Blackwood switched to French, a language he'd studied extensively during his education, asking Solomon to describe the plantation. Solomon responded in fluent French, his accent actually superior to Blackwood's own, describing the layout of the fields, the construction of the buildings, the organization of work crews. His vocabulary was extensive, his grammar perfect, his phrasing natural. Blackwood tried Spanish next, a language he knew less well. Solomon switched effortlessly, maintaining the same descriptive flow. When Blackwood ran out of languages he could verify, he pulled a book from his shelf. A medical text he'd purchased but never fully studied. He opened it randomly and showed Solomon a page on human anatomy, specifically the circulatory system. "Look at this for 30 seconds, Blackwood said. "Then I'll close the book and you'll tell me what you read." Solomon studied the page with focused attention. Blackwood counted to 30 slowly, then closed the book. "Now recite what you saw." Solomon began speaking, reproducing the text word for word, including the technical terminology, the footnotes, even the page number and publication information at the bottom. His recitation was perfect, delivered in the same even tone he used for everything, as though he was simply reading aloud from a document only he could see. The demonstration continued for over an hour. Blackwood tested him with mathematics, languages, memory challenges, logical puzzles. Every test confirmed what the testimonies had claimed. Solomon's intellectual abilities exceeded anything Blackwood had encountered in any human being. Enslaved or free, educated or self-taught. This wasn't merely unusual intelligence. This was something that shouldn't exist. A cognitive capacity, so far beyond normal human limits that it defied rational explanation. When the testing finally ended, Blackwood dismissed Solomon and sat alone in his study, trying to process what he'd witnessed. His initial excitement about acquiring a valuable asset had transformed into something more complex. Solomon wasn't just intelligent. He was intellectually superior to Blackwood himself, superior to anyone Blackwood had ever known. The implications were staggering. Over the following weeks, Blackwood found himself increasingly reliant on Solomon's abilities. He started bringing him into his study daily, presenting problems and challenges, watching in amazement as Solomon solved them instantly. Plantation management questions that would normally require hours of calculation and deliberation, Solomon could answer in moments. Market projections, crop rotation strategies, optimal timing for harvesting, equipment repair diagnosis. All of it Solomon handled with effortless precision. Porter noticed the change and mentioned it to the other overseers one evening in late December. "Mr. Blackwood's spending more time with that new slave than he does managing the plantation," Porter said, concern evident in his voice. 3-4 hours a day they're locked in that study together. "And I've noticed something else, Mr. Blackwood started asking Solomon's opinion before making decisions. Asked him yesterday about whether to purchase additional acreage that came up for sale. Solomon looked at the figures for maybe 2 minutes, then provided an analysis of soil quality, market conditions, and projected returns that took Mr. Blackwood 3 days to verify. and every point Solomon made was correct. The second overseer, a younger man named Davies, shook his head in disbelief. A slave giving investment advice to one of the richest planters in Texas. That's not right. That's not how this works. No, Porter agreed. It's not, and I'm worried about where it leads. Where it led became apparent in mid-January of 1860. Blackwood called Porter to his study and announced he was restructuring plantation operations based on recommendations Solomon had provided. The changes were comprehensive, affecting everything from work crew assignments to planting schedules to equipment maintenance protocols. Porter reviewed the proposals and had to admit they made sense, showed sophisticated understanding of agricultural science and labor efficiency. But their source troubled him deeply. "Sir," Porter said carefully, "these are sound recommendations, but I have to ask, are you comfortable implementing major operational changes based on advice from a slave?" "I'm comfortable implementing changes that will increase our productivity and profits," Blackwood replied, his tone sharp. "Solomon's enslavement doesn't diminish the validity of his insights. If anything, having access to his abilities gives us competitive advantages other plantations lack." "But sir, the other workers are noticing. They see Solomon spending hours in your study. They see you consulting him, deferring to his judgment. It undermines the fundamental structure we depend on. How can we maintain authority when slaves see one of their own operating as your advisor?" Blackwood dismissed the concern, but Porter's words lingered. The fundamental structure. That phrase captured something essential about slavery that Blackwood had always understood intellectually, but never questioned emotionally. The system required strict hierarchy, absolute distinction between owner and owned, master and slave. Intelligence threatened that distinction, suggested that the categories were arbitrary rather than natural. And Solomon's level of intelligence made the arbitrariness impossible to ignore. By February, the situation had deteriorated further. Blackwood found himself not just consulting Solomon, but actively seeking his company, engaging him in conversations that went far beyond plantation business. They discussed philosophy, science, history, literature. Solomon had absorbed more knowledge through his unusual memory than most university graduates acquired through formal education. He could discuss classical Greek philosophy, Renaissance art, contemporary political theory, all with the same depth and nuance that characterized everything about his intellect. These conversations left Blackwood feeling both exhilarated and deeply unsettled. Exhilarated because he'd finally found someone who could match his own intellectual interests, who could challenge his thinking and introduce perspectives he'd never considered. Unsettled because that someone was legally his property, a man he owned as completely as he owned furniture or livestock, yet who was demonstrably more intelligent than himself. The contradiction became unbearable. Blackwood started losing sleep, lying awake, trying to reconcile the reality of Solomon's capabilities with the legal and social structures that defined their relationship. How could he own someone more intelligent than himself? What did it mean about slavery, about racial hierarchies, about all the justifications Southern society offered for the system if someone like Solomon existed? These questions had no comfortable answers, and Blackwood found himself increasingly avoiding them by spending more time with Solomon, as though proximity to that remarkable mind could somehow resolve the contradictions through sheer intellectual force. The other enslaved people at Oleander had begun responding to Solomon differently as well. Despite his isolation, despite his refusal to socialize, they'd observed his unusual relationship with Blackwood. Word had spread about his intelligence, about his abilities, about the way the master consulted him like an advisor rather than ordering him like a slave. Some viewed this with suspicion, wondering if Solomon was collaborating with Blackwood against them. Others saw it differently, saw in Solomon's intelligence a possibility they'd been taught to deny, proof that the supposed natural order wasn't natural at all. A woman named Sarah, who worked in the main house kitchen and had opportunity to observe both Blackwood and Solomon, mentioned this to Porter one evening when he came to the kitchen for coffee. "That man Solomon," she said quietly, "he's changing things just by being what he is, Mr. Blackwood can't look at him without seeing something that contradicts everything he believes about us. And we can't look at Solomon without seeing proof that what they tell us about our limitations is a lie. That's dangerous talk," Porter warned, though his tone carried more concern than threat. "It's true talk," Sarah corrected, "and truth is always dangerous to people who profit from lies." The situation reached its crisis point on March 3, 1860. Blackwood had called Solomon to his study to review quarterly financial reports, a routine they'd established weeks earlier. But this time, instead of presenting the reports immediately, Blackwood sat in silence for several minutes while Solomon stood waiting. Finally, Blackwood spoke, his voice strained. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you understand the position your intelligence puts me in?" "I'm not certain what you mean, sir," Solomon replied, though his tone suggested he understood perfectly. "I mean that I own you, legally completely. You are my property. Yet you are intellectually superior to me in ways I can't even fully measure. You solve problems I can't solve, understand concepts I can barely grasp, see patterns and connections that exceed my own cognitive abilities. How am I supposed to reconcile those realities? How am I supposed to maintain the authority this system requires when I know with absolute certainty that you are more capable than I am?" The question hung in the air between them. Solomon stood motionless, his expression neutral, waiting. When he spoke, his words were chosen with obvious care. "Sir, if I may speak freely." "You may. The contradiction you're experiencing isn't caused by me. It existed before you purchased me, before you met me, before I was born. The contradiction is built into slavery itself. The system requires believing that enslaved people are inferior, naturally suited to servitude, incapable of the full humanity that would make their enslavement unjust. But that belief can only be maintained if evidence contradicting it is suppressed or ignored. My existence makes the evidence impossible to ignore. I don't create the contradiction. I simply make it visible." Blackwood listened with growing agitation. "You're saying slavery is unjust. I'm saying that owning human beings requires justifications that cannot survive honest examination. You asked me to speak freely, sir. That's what I'm doing. And you believe you deserve freedom?" Solomon's expression flickered, perhaps the first genuine emotion Blackwood had seen from him. "I believe all human beings deserve freedom, sir, but I also understand that belief changes nothing about my circumstances. I exist within a legal and social structure that defines me as property regardless of my capabilities. What I believe about justice has no bearing on what will happen to me." The conversation ended shortly after, but it echoed in Blackwood's mind for days. He found himself unable to focus on plantation business, distracted by thoughts he'd never allowed himself to consider seriously before. What if Solomon was right? What if slavery's justifications were lies? Comfortable fictions maintained through willful ignorance. And if those justifications were lies, what did that make Blackwood himself? A man who'd built wealth through systematic injustice, who'd profited from the suffering of people whose humanity he deliberately refused to acknowledge. These questions might have remained abstract philosophical problems if not for what happened on March 15th. A group of abolitionists had been distributing pamphlets in Galveston, materials arguing against slavery on moral and religious grounds. One of these pamphlets made its way to Oleander, passed among the enslaved workers in secret, and eventually reached Solomon. Porter discovered Solomon reading it in the early morning, before most workers were awake. The pamphlet laid out arguments against slavery in terms that combined moral philosophy, religious teaching, and practical analysis of the system's effects on society. Porter confiscated it immediately and brought it to Blackwood, explaining where he'd found it and what Solomon had been doing. Blackwood examined the pamphlet with growing fury, not fury at Solomon, but fury at himself, because every argument in the document echoed thoughts he'd been having since his conversation with Solomon 2 weeks earlier. The pamphlet wasn't telling him anything he didn't already know. It was simply articulating truths he'd been avoiding. He called Solomon to his study that evening. "Porter found you reading abolitionist literature," Blackwood said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Do you understand how dangerous that is? Possession of such materials by a slave is illegal. I could have you whipped, branded, sold to the most brutal buyer I could find." "Yes, sir," Solomon said. "I understand the risks." "Then why take them?" "Because the pamphlet contained ideas worth understanding, sir. I read everything I encounter. That's my nature. I cannot selectively ignore information because it's dangerous." "And do you agree with what it said? Do you believe slavery should be abolished?" Solomon met his gaze with that unsettling directness. "Sir, I believe slavery is morally indefensible. I believe it corrupts everyone it touches, enslaved and enslaver alike. I believe it will eventually destroy Southern society, either through internal collapse or external force. And I believe you've reached the same conclusions, which is why my presence troubles you so deeply. I don't threaten you with violence or rebellion. I threaten you by making it impossible to avoid truths you've spent your life denying." The words struck Blackwood like physical blows. He stood abruptly, walked to his window, stared out at the plantation grounds where over 100 human beings lived and worked under his authority. Their labor generating his wealth, their suffering funding his comfortable existence. The sunset painted everything in warm golden light, making it all look peaceful, almost beautiful. But he couldn't unsee what Solomon had forced him to see, couldn't return to the comfortable certainties that had once made this life seem natural and justified. "Get out," Blackwood said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go back to your quarters. I need to think." Solomon left silently. Blackwood remained at the window until long after dark, watching the slave quarters in the distance, seeing them differently than he'd ever seen them before. Not as housing for labor, but as prisons for people. Not as necessary infrastructure for agricultural production, but as monuments to systematic injustice. Solomon hadn't told him anything revolutionary. He'd simply made visible what had always been true. The next morning, Blackwood made a decision that would alter everything that followed. He called for his lawyer, a Charleston man named Morrison, who handled legal matters for several wealthy planters. Morrison arrived 3 days later, and Blackwood met with him privately in his study. "I need you to prepare manumission papers," Blackwood said without preamble. Morrison's surprise was evident. "For which slave?" "Solomon, the one I purchased in December from Galveston." "May I ask why? Has he proven problematic?" "No, he's proven extraordinary. Too extraordinary. I can't keep him, Morrison. I've tried and I can't do it. His intelligence makes the entire system visible in ways I can't live with. I need him freed." Morrison had handled strange requests before, but this was unprecedented. "Mr. Blackwood, Do you understand what you're saying? You paid $400 for this man less than 4 months ago. He's valuable and you want to simply free him? I want to free him, because keeping him enslaved is destroying me, Blackwood said, the words coming out with desperate intensity. Every day he remains here, every conversation we have, every time I see him, I'm confronted with the fundamental injustice of what I'm doing. Not just to him, to all of them. He's shown me things about slavery, about myself, that I can't unsee. The only way I can continue functioning is if he's gone. Then sell him, Morrison suggested. Let someone else deal with the complications. I can't do that either. I can't pass this problem to another person knowing what I know about him. That would make me complicit in continuing his enslavement. The only ethical option is manumission. Morrison tried to argue, explain the legal complications, the social repercussions, the financial loss, but Blackwood was immovable. The paperwork was prepared over the following week. On March 28, 1860, just 3 months and 21 days after purchasing Solomon, James Blackwood signed documents granting him freedom. The signing took place in Blackwood's study. Solomon stood silently while Blackwood and Morrison completed the necessary forms, his expression revealing nothing. When the papers were finished, Blackwood handed them to Solomon along with 50 delov. More than the law required, but less than seemed adequate for what Blackwood was trying to achieve. You're free, Blackwood said, the words feeling inadequate and enormous simultaneously. Under state law, you have 90 days to leave Texas or you'll be re-enslaved. I suggest you head north immediately. Solomon accepted the papers and the money, studying both briefly before looking up at Blackwood. Why? He asked simply. Why free me when you could have sold me for profit? Because you were right, Blackwood said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. About everything. About slavery, about the contradictions, about what your presence revealed. I can't own someone who's forced me to see truths I'd spent my life avoiding. I can't continue profiting from a system I now understand is fundamentally evil. Freeing you doesn't absolve me of what I've done, of the wealth I've built on slavery, of the lives I've controlled and damaged. But it's the only thing I can do that doesn't make me complicit in one more day of your enslavement. Solomon absorbed this, his expression shifting slightly, perhaps the closest he ever came to showing genuine emotion. And the others? He asked quietly. The 143 people who remain enslaved here. What about their intelligence, their humanity, their right to freedom? The question cut straight to the heart of everything. Blackwood had no answer. That didn't reveal the inadequacy of his gesture. He was freeing one man while keeping over 100 others in bondage. The contradiction was obvious and damning. I don't know, Blackwood admitted. I don't know how to reconcile that. I don't know how to free them without destroying everything I've built, without facing financial ruin and social exile. I'm not brave enough for that. I can only do this one thing, and even this feels like it might destroy me. Solomon nodded slowly, accepting the honesty, if not the justification. Then I thank you for my freedom, Mr. Blackwood, while acknowledging its incompleteness. Perhaps that's all any of us can do in this world. Take what small actions we can manage and hope they matter somehow. He turned and walked out of the study, out of the main house, down the plantation road toward Galveston, and whatever life awaited him beyond 90 days. Blackwood watched from his window until Solomon disappeared from view, then sat heavily in his chair and tried to understand what he'd just done and what it meant for everything that would follow. The story might have ended there, with Solomon walking into freedom, and Blackwood left to wrestle with his compromised conscience. But what happened next would prove that freeing Solomon had set in motion consequences far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Word of Solomon's manumission spread through Oleander Plantation within hours of his departure. The news created ripples that no one, least of all Blackwood, had fully anticipated. Over 100 enslaved people watched a man walk away free, not through escape or purchase by relatives, but through a master's voluntary decision to release him. The implications were profound and immediate. Sarah, the kitchen worker who'd observed Solomon's effect on Blackwood, spoke to others that evening in careful whispers. Mr. Blackwood freed him because Solomon's intelligence made slavery impossible to justify. Think about what that means. It means Blackwood knows the whole system is built on lies. Knows we're human beings who deserve freedom, just like Solomon did. He freed one man because he couldn't deny that man's humanity. But what about ours? Are we less human, less deserving? The questions had no comfortable answers, but they circulated through the slave quarters, passed in fragments of conversation during work breaks, discussed in the precious private moments workers carved from their surveilled existence. Solomon had been with them only 3 months, had never spoken to most of them directly, had remained isolated and separate. Yet his presence and subsequent freedom had fundamentally altered how they understood their own circumstances. Porter noticed the change immediately. Workers who'd been compliant for years began asking questions, hesitating before following orders, showing subtle signs of resistance that hadn't existed before. Nothing overt enough to justify punishment, just a shift in atmosphere. A sense that something fundamental had cracked in the plantation's social structure. He mentioned this to Blackwood during their daily review of operations. "The workers are unsettled, sir," Porter said carefully. "Solomon's freedom has created expectations, raised questions about why he was freed and others weren't. We need to address this before it develops into something more serious." Blackwood, who'd been struggling with his own turmoil since signing the manumission papers, responded with uncharacteristic sharpness. "What would you have me do?" "Porter, explain that I freed Solomon because his intelligence made me recognize the injustice of slavery, but I'm keeping everyone else enslaved because I lack the courage to follow that recognition to its logical conclusion. How exactly do I explain that without admitting I'm a hypocrite and a coward?" The outburst shocked both men. Blackwood had never spoken so openly about his internal conflicts, had always maintained the professional distance expected of plantation management. Porter stood silent, uncertain how to respond to this sudden honesty. "I apologize," Blackwood said after a moment, his voice controlled again. "That was inappropriate. Maintain standard discipline. If anyone becomes genuinely problematic, report it to me. Otherwise, continue normal operations." But normal operations proved impossible to maintain. Over the following weeks, small acts of resistance multiplied. Tools went missing and reappeared in wrong locations. Work proceeded slightly slower than usual, not enough to justify punishment, but enough to reduce productivity. Conversations stopped abruptly when overseers approached, suggesting discussions that couldn't be overheard. The plantation was functioning, but the efficiency and control that had characterized Oleander for years had deteriorated. Blackwood found himself increasingly isolated, avoided by neighboring planters who'd heard about Solomon's manumission and viewed it as eccentric at best, dangerous at worst. One evening in late April, he received a visit from 3 plantation owners who claimed friendship, but whose purpose was clearly confrontation. They sat in Blackwood's study, accepting his hospitality while preparing to challenge his decisions. The eldest of them, a man named Thornton, who owned 8,000 acres to the south, spoke first. "James, we've known each other for years, so I'm going to be direct. Your decision to free that slave Solomon has created problems that extend beyond your plantation. Word has spread. Our workers have heard about it, have started asking questions, showing signs of unrest. You've introduced an instability into the entire region. I freed one man, Blackwood replied, though his voice carried no real conviction. One man in a region where thousands remain enslaved. How does that create instability? The second visitor, a younger planter named Hutchkins, leaned forward. Because you freed him after he demonstrated exceptional intelligence. You're confirming what abolitionists claim. That slaves are capable of intellectual achievement. That their enslavement isn't based on natural inferiority, but on legal structures that could be changed. Every slave who hears about Solomon starts wondering why intelligence should determine freedom, starts questioning the entire system. Good, Blackwood said, surprising himself with his own boldness. Maybe the system should be questioned. The three visitors exchanged glances. The third man, a cotton broker named Simmons, who owned plantations in both Texas and Louisiana, spoke with careful deliberation. James, you're talking like an abolitionist. Is that what you've become? The question demanded an answer Blackwood hadn't fully formulated for himself. He stood and walked to his window, looking out at grounds that had once represented achievement, and now felt like monuments to crimes he was only beginning to acknowledge. I don't know what I've become, he said finally. I know what I've seen. I know that Solomon's intelligence forced me to recognize truths I'd been avoiding. I know that I can no longer comfortably profit from owning human beings while pretending that ownership is somehow natural or justified. Beyond that, I'm uncertain about everything. Then let me provide some certainty, Thornton said, his voice hardening. If you continue down this path, if you continue expressing these views, you'll be ostracized from this community. Your business relationships will dissolve, your social standing will collapse, and your plantation will fail because no one will trade with a man who's betrayed the interests of slaveholding society. The threat was clear and credible. Blackwood understood that his wealth, his position, his entire life depended on maintaining relationships within a community that absolutely required loyalty to slavery's continuation. Questioning that system meant sacrificing everything he'd built. I understand, Blackwood said quietly. Thank you for your clarity. The visitors left shortly after, satisfied they'd delivered their warning effectively. Blackwood remained at his window long into the night, watching his plantation operate in the darkness, understanding that he faced an impossible choice. He could continue as before, accepting the hypocrisy of keeping people enslaved, while knowing it was unjust, preserving his wealth and position at the cost of his conscience. Or he could follow his emerging convictions, potentially freeing more workers, openly opposing slavery, and accepting the social and financial destruction that would follow. He'd freed Solomon, believing it would ease his internal conflict. Instead, it had intensified everything, made the contradictions more visible and more painful. Solomon hadn't just revealed the injustice of his own enslavement. He'd illuminated the entire system, made it impossible for Blackwood to pretend he didn't understand exactly what he was participating in every day. Meanwhile, Solomon himself had traveled north from Galveston, using his 50 Dio and his remarkable intelligence to navigate toward freedom. He'd purchased passage on a ship bound for New Orleans, from there to Memphis, then overland toward free states where his manumission papers would be recognized and respected. The journey took weeks, each stage requiring careful planning and constant vigilance. Free papers meant little in a society that assumed every black person was enslaved unless proven otherwise. And Solomon's intelligence, while valuable, also made him conspicuous and potentially dangerous in the eyes of slave catchers and suspicious whites. In Memphis, while waiting for river passage north, Solomon encountered a situation that would prove significant in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He'd taken temporary work loading cargo at the docks, a job that allowed him to earn additional money while maintaining low visibility. One afternoon, he overheard a conversation between two men discussing a mathematical problem related to ship loading and weight distribution. The calculations were complex, involving multiple variables, and the men were struggling to determine whether their proposed cargo arrangement would keep the vessel stable during river travel. Solomon listened for perhaps 5 minutes, then quietly approached and offered a solution. He explained the calculation, demonstrated why their current plan would create dangerous imbalance, and suggested a modified arrangement that would distribute weight more effectively. The men, initially suspicious of a black man offering unsolicited advice, became increasingly attentive as they realized his solution was not only correct, but showed understanding of engineering principles they only partially grasped. One of the men, a shipping merchant named Wallace, asked Solomon directly, "How do you know these things?" "I remember everything I observe, sir," Solomon replied, using the same careful explanation he'd given many times before. "I've watched ships being loaded, read books on naval engineering when I had access to them, observed patterns in how vessels handle different weight distributions. The knowledge accumulates." Wallace studied him with shrewd interest. "You're educated." "I'm self-taught, sir. I'm also free." Solomon showed his manumission papers, traveling north to Massachusetts, where I hope to establish a life beyond slavery's reach. The conversation that followed would change Solomon's trajectory in unexpected ways. Wallace, impressed by Solomon's abilities and recognizing potential value, offered him employment, not as a laborer, but as a consultant on shipping logistics, a role that would utilize his mathematical and analytical capabilities. The salary offered was modest by white standards, but substantial for a newly freed black man, and the work would be conducted discreetly to avoid the social complications of a white merchant openly relying on black intelligence. Solomon accepted, understanding the compromise involved, but also recognizing opportunity. He remained in Memphis for 3 months, working with Wallace and other merchants, applying his abilities to complex logistical problems, earning money and building connections that would serve him later. During this period, he also began documenting his experiences, writing detailed accounts of slavery manumission, and the peculiar position of being a freed black man whose intelligence exceeded most whites he encountered, but whose legal and social status remained precarious. These writings, preserved in a collection at the Library of Congress and only discovered in 1974, provide extraordinary insight into Solomon's perspective on his own existence. In one entry dated May 20, 1860, he reflected on what had happened at Oleander Plantation. "Mr. Blackwood freed me because my intelligence made slavery's injustice unavoidable for him. He could not own someone demonstrably more capable than himself without confronting the arbitrary nature of our respective positions." His action, while personally significant, reveals the fundamental limitation of individual moral awakenings within systemic evil. He freed one man while keeping over 100 others enslaved, satisfied that this partial gesture somehow addressed the deeper problem. It does not. It merely transfers the burden of contradiction from him to me. I am free because I was exceptional. What does that say about those who remain enslaved? That their intelligence is insufficient, that their humanity is less worthy of recognition. The logic condemns itself, but I doubt Mr. Blackwood will follow it to its conclusion. Most people cannot bear the full weight of their own moral knowledge. The observation was devastating in its accuracy. Back at Oleander, Blackwood was indeed struggling with exactly the contradiction Solomon described. The plantation continued operating. Workers remained enslaved. Cotton production proceeded on schedule. But Blackwood found himself unable to engage with any of it without crushing awareness of what it meant. Every interaction with enslaved workers reminded him that he was maintaining their bondage, while knowing it was indefensible. Every business decision felt like complicity in ongoing crimes. Every profit calculation became an accounting of human suffering converted into personal wealth. By June, his health had begun deteriorating. He slept poorly, ate little, withdrew from social obligations he'd once fulfilled automatically. Porter and the other overseers noticed, but attributed it to stress from Solomon's controversial manumission and the social consequences that followed. They didn't understand that the cause ran deeper, that Blackwood was experiencing a psychological collapse triggered by the gap between what he knew and what he continued to do. On June 18th, Blackwood made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He called his lawyer Morrison back to Oleander and instructed him to prepare documents for the gradual emancipation of every enslaved person on the plantation. Not immediate freedom, which would have been financially catastrophic and socially impossible, but a structured plan where workers would transition from slavery to paid labor over a period of 5 years, with manumission granted in stages based on age and circumstances. Morrison was appalled. "Mr. Blackwood, what you're proposing is financial suicide. You'll be ruined. Every other planter in the region will view this as betrayal. You'll be ostracized, possibly face violence from those who see gradual emancipation as encouraging slave rebellion. I strongly advise against this course of action. I'm not asking your advice on whether to do it," Blackwood replied, his voice carrying a certainty born of desperation. "I'm instructing you to prepare the legal documents. If you refuse, I'll find another lawyer who will." The documents were prepared over the following week. Blackwood reviewed them carefully, made modifications, finalized the plan. On June 25, 1860, he assembled every enslaved person at Oleander in the main yard and read the emancipation plan aloud. The announcement created chaos, disbelief, hope, suspicion, and fear in roughly equal measure. Workers who'd lived their entire lives in bondage suddenly confronted the possibility of freedom. Not immediately, but foreseeable, structured, real. The response from the surrounding planter community was immediate and vicious. Within 2 days, Blackwood found himself completely isolated. Merchants refused his business. Banks questioned his financial stability. Neighbors stopped speaking to him. His fellow planters issued a formal statement condemning his actions as dangerous to the social order and threatening to the institution of slavery itself. If you're finding this story as compelling as I am, share it with someone who needs to hear these buried truths. Hit that like button to support content that reveals the complexity of American history, the moral struggles that defined this era, and the individuals whose intelligence threatened entire systems of power. Let's continue discovering what happened when one man's extraordinary abilities revealed truths that 19th century Texas wasn't ready to face. By July, Blackwood's financial position had become precarious. Without access to normal credit and trade relationships, running a plantation of Oleander's size became extremely difficult. Equipment repairs couldn't be completed because suppliers refused service. Crop sales had to be negotiated through hostile intermediaries who charged excessive commissions. Workers, now promised eventual freedom, showed understandable confusion about how to navigate the transition between slavery and whatever would follow. Porter, who'd served Blackwood loyally for 8 years, requested a private conversation in mid-July. They met in Blackwood's study, where so many crucial conversations had occurred. "Sir, I need to tender my resignation," Porter said, his discomfort evident. "I've received offers from other plantations, and given the current circumstances, I believe it's best for both of us if I accept one of those positions." Blackwood had expected this, but still felt the weight of it. "I understand. You've been an excellent overseer, Porter. I don't blame you for seeking stability elsewhere. May I speak frankly, sir?" "Please." "What you're doing, this gradual emancipation plan, it's admirable in some ways, shows moral courage that most planters lack. But it's also destroying you, destroying this plantation. And I'm not certain it will actually help the people you're trying to free. They'll be freed into a society that despises them, that will deny them opportunities, that will make their freedom nearly as oppressive as their slavery. You're sacrificing everything for a gesture that may ultimately prove meaningless." The observation echoed Solomon's written reflection about partial gestures within systemic evil. Blackwood recognized its accuracy, but had no response that didn't confirm Porter's point. "Perhaps you're right," Blackwood said quietly. "Perhaps I'm destroying myself for nothing. But I can't continue as before. Solomon showed me something I can't unsee, and living with that knowledge while doing nothing felt worse than any consequence of trying to act on it. If I'm wrong, at least I'm wrong while attempting to do something other than perpetuate injustice." Porter left Oleander the following week. The 2 other overseers followed within days. By August, Blackwood was attempting to manage the plantation largely alone, assisted only by a few hired workers who commanded high wages due to the risk of associating with him. The situation was unsustainable, and everyone recognized it. Meanwhile, Solomon had left Memphis and continued north, reaching Cincinnati by late July. The city, positioned on the border between slave and free states, had a significant free black population and abolitionist community. Here Solomon found something approaching stability. He took work as a clerk for a merchant who valued intelligence over racial prejudice, and continued his writing. His reflections from this period show increasing awareness of his unique position. He was free, educated, extraordinarily intelligent, and black in a society that couldn't reconcile those attributes. His existence challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy, about the justifications for slavery, about the nature of intelligence and humanity. Everywhere he went, people responded to him with confusion, suspicion, or fascination, unable to categorize someone who violated so many expected patterns. In an entry dated August 5, 1860, Solomon wrote about the psychological burden of his capabilities. "Intelligence is commonly understood as advantage, as asset, as positive attribute that improves life circumstances. For enslaved people, this assumption proves false. Intelligence in bondage becomes curse. Rather than blessing, it means understanding fully the injustice of your position, seeing clearly the mechanisms of your oppression, recognizing with absolute clarity that your enslavement derives from social constructions rather than natural law. Ignorance might have offered some protection, some buffer against the full weight of circumstantial awareness. Intelligence offers no such mercy. Every moment of slavery was informed by perfect understanding of its wrongness, its arbitrariness, its violation of my humanity. Now in freedom, intelligence proves equally problematic. I understand too well how precarious this freedom is, how dependent on laws that could change, how vulnerable to social forces that view my existence as threat rather than human reality. I cannot enjoy simple relief at escape from bondage, because I see too clearly all the ways my freedom remains conditional, limited, surrounded by hostility. Sometimes I wonder if my unusual memory is gift or affliction. Most people forget the worst moments of their lives, allow memory to soften suffering, find peace through gradual fading of painful experience. I forget nothing. Every moment of slavery remains perfectly preserved in my mind. Every indignity, every fear, every instance of dehumanization available for recall with absolute clarity. This permanence of memory means freedom cannot erase slavery's impact. The past remains eternally present, perfectly accessible, vivid as the moment it occurred. Perhaps this is what made previous owners uncomfortable. Not my intelligence alone, but the sense that I carried perfect record of everything. That nothing could be forgotten or overlooked. That every action taken against me would be preserved with absolute fidelity in a memory that never released anything it captured. The writing reveals psychological complexity that historians have found fascinating. Solomon wasn't just unusually intelligent. He carried awareness of his own exceptionalism and the burdens that accompanied it, demonstrated remarkable insight into how his abilities affected others, and showed understanding of the impossible position his existence created within a society built on racial hierarchies. Back in Texas, Blackwood's situation continued deteriorating. By September, he'd lost most of his workforce. Many of the enslaved people at Oleander, promised future freedom but facing present instability, had run away, seeking immediate liberty rather than waiting for gradual emancipation. Blackwood didn't pursue them, didn't report them to authorities, essentially allowing escape while maintaining legal plausibility that he was the victim of theft rather than facilitator of flight. His plantation, once among the most productive in the region, was barely functioning. Cotton fields went largely unharvested. Equipment fell into disrepair. The main house showed signs of neglect as domestic workers departed. Blackwood himself appeared to age years in months, his health declining under the combined weight of social ostracism, financial pressure, and psychological turmoil. In late September, he received an unexpected letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the postmark showed Cincinnati, and the signature at the bottom read simply, Solomon. The letter, preserved in the Blackwood family papers and now held by the Texas State Archives, reads, Mr. Blackwood, I write to you from Cincinnati, where I have established residence and employment. I hope this letter finds you well, though I suspect, based on my understanding of how plantation society responds to deviation from accepted norms, that you are facing significant difficulties because of your decision to free me and subsequently plan for gradual emancipation of your remaining workers. I want to say several things. First, I thank you sincerely for my freedom. Whatever motivated that decision, whatever contradictions remain unresolved, you gave me something precious that I had no legal right to expect. That gift has enabled me to build a life that, while still constrained by racial prejudice and social limitations, offers possibilities that would have been impossible in continued bondage. Second, I want to acknowledge the courage required for your actions, both in freeing me and in attempting gradual emancipation, despite knowing the social and financial consequences. Most people cannot act against their own interests, even when they recognize moral necessity. You did so imperfectly and incompletely perhaps, but genuinely. That matters. Third, I want to address what I suspect may be troubling you most deeply. You freed one man while keeping others enslaved, then attempted broader emancipation, only after facing criticism for that initial inconsistency. You might wonder if your actions were principled or merely reactive. Whether you acted from genuine moral conviction or from psychological pressure I inadvertently created. I cannot answer that for you. Motives are complex, and perhaps the distinction matters less than the outcome. What I can say is this: Change rarely comes from pure motives or perfect conviction. It comes from accumulations of pressure, contradictions that become unbearable, moments when maintaining existing structures costs more than transforming them. You freed me because my existence made slavery's injustice unavoidable. That doesn't diminish the act. It simply locates it within human psychology rather than idealized morality. Finally, I want to tell you something I've come to understand about intelligence, particularly the extraordinary intelligence I apparently possess. It doesn't make me better than others. It makes me different. And that difference has been both blessing and curse. Intelligence allowed me to understand my enslavement with painful clarity, to recognize patterns and possibilities that offered hope of freedom, to navigate the complex path from bondage to liberty. But it also isolated me, made me incomprehensible to most people I encountered, created barriers between myself and others who couldn't understand how my mind worked. Your discomfort around me was reasonable response to that difference, not moral failing. You freed me partly because you couldn't bear owning someone whose intelligence exceeded your own. But perhaps more importantly, you freed me because my difference made the entire system visible in new ways, revealed contradictions you'd successfully ignored until forced to confront them directly. That visibility, that revelation matters more than the discomfort that prompted it. I don't know what will become of you, Mr. Blackwood, or your plantation, or your attempted emancipation plan. I hope you find ways to persist despite opposition, to complete what you've begun despite costs. But even if circumstances force you to abandon those plans, even if financial and social pressure prove overwhelming, know that your actions mattered to me and will matter to others who learn this history. You weren't perfect. You didn't solve the problems you recognized. But you tried, and that trying created possibilities that didn't exist before. May you find peace with whatever comes next. Respectfully, Solomon. Blackwood read the letter multiple times, finding in it both comfort and challenge. Solomon had offered understanding without excusing the contradictions, had acknowledged Blackwood's actions while not absolving him of continued complicity, had provided perspective that was generous but not naive. The letter became something Blackwood returned to repeatedly in the difficult months that followed. A reminder that his struggles had been witnessed and evaluated by the person whose existence had triggered them. By December of 1860, exactly 1 year after purchasing Solomon, Blackwood had lost Oleander Plantation. Financial pressures combined with social ostracism and the practical difficulties of operating without normal business relationships had forced him into bankruptcy. The plantation was sold to settle debts, purchased by a consortium of neighboring planters who had no interest in continuing gradual emancipation plans. The enslaved workers who remained were absorbed into other plantations, their promised freedom rescinded when ownership transferred. Blackwood himself moved to Galveston, taking modest employment as a clerk, living in circumstances far removed from the wealth and status he'd once commanded. He never fully recovered financially or socially from his attempt to act on moral convictions that contradicted the society he lived in. But letters and diary entries from his later life suggest he also never regretted the attempt, never wished he'd chosen differently, never longed to return to comfortable ignorance about slavery's injustice. In an entry from 1862, as the Civil War raged and slavery's end approached through violence rather than gradual emancipation, Blackwood reflected, "I purchased Solomon, believing I was acquiring a valuable asset. Instead, I acquired a mirror that reflected truths I'd spent my life avoiding. He didn't cause my moral awakening through manipulation or persuasion. He simply existed with capabilities that made slavery's justifications obviously false. Intelligence was supposed to belong to us, to whites, to masters. It was evidence of our natural superiority, justification for our dominance. Solomon's existence proved that intelligence had nothing to do with race, that the hierarchies we'd constructed were arbitrary rather than natural, that the entire system depended on lies we told ourselves to maintain comfortable exploitation. I couldn't own him once I understood that. Couldn't look at him without seeing the injustice of every person I kept enslaved. Freeing him didn't solve anything. Didn't end my complicity. Didn't create justice. But it was the only action I could take that didn't require complete self-deception. Perhaps that's all moral action ever is in systems of injustice. Small gestures that acknowledge truth while lacking power to transform the larger structure. I lost everything making those gestures. I would lose it all again rather than live with the alternative. Solomon's life after leaving Texas followed a trajectory that few freed slaves of his era could have imagined, yet remained constrained by the racial realities of 19th century America. His intelligence, which had caused such disruption in the slave system, proved equally disruptive in free society, creating opportunities while simultaneously marking him as dangerous, exceptional, and ultimately incomprehensible to most people he encountered. In Cincinnati, Solomon established himself within the city's free black community, while maintaining employment with merchants who recognized his analytical abilities. His work involved complex calculations, logistical planning, and problem-solving that would typically require multiple employees or extensive time investment. Solomon performed these tasks with the same effortless precision that had characterized everything about his intellectual capabilities. Completing in hours what took others days, seeing patterns and solutions that escaped even experienced professionals. But this success came with significant costs. His employer, a merchant named Dalton, who'd hired Solomon based on recommendations from the Memphis shipping merchant Wallace, insisted on keeping Solomon's role ambiguous and his contributions unacknowledged publicly. White clients and business partners couldn't be allowed to know that a black man was performing calculations and analysis their own experts struggled with. Solomon's intelligence had to remain invisible. His contributions attributed to others, his presence explained as clerical assistance rather than intellectual partnership. This concealment created psychological strain that Solomon documented in his ongoing writings. In an entry from January 1861, he reflected on the peculiar burden of hidden capability. Freedom has granted me legal status as human being rather than property, but it has not granted me social permission to exist as an intelligent human being. My capabilities must be hidden, disguised, attributed to others. I perform complex analysis that shapes business decisions involving thousands of dollars. Yet I cannot acknowledge that role publicly without threatening the racial fictions that make white society comfortable. So I work in shadows, valuable but invisible, necessary but unacknowledged. In slavery, my intelligence was threat because it contradicted justifications for my enslavement. In freedom, my intelligence is threat because it contradicts justifications for my inferior social status. The legal circumstances have changed. The fundamental problem remains. A black man with extraordinary intelligence challenges assumptions that American society, North and South, requires for its racial hierarchies to seem natural and justified. I am free to labor, free to exist, but not free to be fully visible as who I am. The situation intensified as the Civil War began in April 1861. Cincinnati's position as a border city made it a crucial location for military logistics, and Solomon's analytical abilities became increasingly valuable for understanding supply chains, troop movements, and strategic planning. Through Dalton's connections, Solomon's work came to the attention of Union military officials who needed exactly the kind of complex calculation and pattern recognition he could provide. By late 1861, Solomon was working directly, though still unofficially, with Union Army logistics officers. His contributions included calculating optimal supply routes, projecting resource needs based on troop deployments, analyzing enemy movement patterns from reconnaissance reports, and solving mathematical problems related to artillery trajectories and fortification designs. The work was genuinely significant, potentially affecting military outcomes. Yet Solomon received no official recognition, no formal position, no public acknowledgement of his role. A Union officer named Colonel Matthews, who worked with Solomon on supply logistics, wrote in his private diary about the experience. The diary, discovered in an attic in Vermont in 1989 and subsequently donated to the National Archives, provides remarkable insight into how military officials viewed Solomon. We employ a Negroid freeman named Solomon for calculations related to supply chain management. His abilities are extraordinary, frankly beyond anything I've encountered in trained military engineers. He can analyze complex logistical problems involving multiple variables, thousands of soldiers, vast distances, and limited resources, then provide solutions that prove consistently accurate when implemented. Yesterday, he calculated supply needs for a division being deployed to Kentucky, accounting for travel time, weather conditions, available transport, and probable consumption rates. He completed the calculation in approximately 15 minutes. Our regular logistics staff had been working on the same problem for 3 days, and still had not reached confident conclusions. When we compared results, Solomon's figures proved more accurate. Yet, we cannot officially acknowledge his contributions. The men under my command would not accept orders based on analysis performed by a Negro, regardless of how accurate that analysis proves. So we attribute his work to white officers on my staff, maintain the fiction that our strategic planning derives from conventional military expertise. This deception troubles me. We depend on this man's intelligence while denying his humanity sufficiently to credit his contributions. We use him as we would use a calculating machine, valuable for output, but unworthy of recognition as a thinking, reasoning person deserving respect. The contradiction seems obvious, but military necessity overrides moral consistency. We need his abilities too desperately to allow principle to interfere with pragmatism. Solomon's work for the Union Army continued through 1862 and into 1863, his contributions growing more significant as the war escalated and logistical complexity increased. But his position remained precarious, unofficial, dependent on individuals rather than institutional recognition. He received payment for his work, enough to live comfortably by the standards of free blacks in Cincinnati, but nothing approaching what white professionals with equivalent capabilities would have commanded. During this period, Solomon also became involved with abolitionist networks, operating in Cincinnati. The city was a major hub for the Underground Railroad, and Solomon's intelligence proved valuable for coordinating escape routes, timing movements to avoid patrols, and solving logistical problems that arose when moving large numbers of fugitive slaves north toward Canada. His perfect memory meant he could retain complex information about safe houses, contacts, schedules, and procedures without written documentation that could be discovered and used against the network. A Quaker abolitionist named Elizabeth Morris, who worked extensively with the Underground Railroad, mentioned Solomon in letters to her sister in Philadelphia. These letters, preserved in the Quaker archives and made public in 1992, describe Solomon's role. We are assisted by a remarkable man named Solomon, a freedman from Texas, whose intellectual capabilities exceed anyone I have encountered. He remembers every detail of every conversation, can calculate distances and timing with perfect accuracy, and demonstrates understanding of human psychology that helps us predict how slave catchers and authorities will respond to various situations. His contributions have undoubtedly saved lives, helped dozens of fugitive slaves reach safety who might otherwise have been captured. Yet, he remains unknown outside our small network, his name never mentioned in public, his role carefully concealed to protect both him and the work we do. I sometimes wonder what Solomon might have achieved if born white, if his extraordinary intelligence had been allowed full expression in a society designed to recognize and reward such capabilities. Instead, he operates in shadows, essential but invisible, brilliant but constrained by racial prejudices that deny his fundamental humanity. The pattern Morris described, Solomon's combination of extraordinary capability and enforced invisibility, characterized his entire existence in freedom. He was simultaneously invaluable and unacknowledgeable, necessary and impossible, exceptional and threatening. His intelligence made him useful to those who recognized it. But that same intelligence made him dangerous to social structures dependent on believing black people were intellectually inferior to whites. In 1863, as the Emancipation Proclamation took effect, and the war's purpose shifted explicitly to ending slavery, Solomon's writings took on new dimensions. He reflected on what emancipation would mean for millions of enslaved people whose intelligence, while perhaps less extraordinary than his own, was equally real and equally denied by the system that had held them in bondage. The proclamation declares enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, though its actual enforcement depends on Union military success. When that freedom comes, when slavery finally ends, millions of people will face the question, I have navigated for 3 years. What does freedom mean when society remains structured to deny your full humanity? Legal emancipation is necessary but insufficient. It ends slavery without ending prejudice, grants liberty without granting equality, provides rights without providing means to exercise those rights effectively. I think about the people I knew at Oleander Plantation, the workers who watched me walk away free while they remained enslaved. If they survive to see emancipation, what will they encounter? A society that resents their freedom, denies them education, limits their economic opportunities, maintains through custom and violence the subordinate position that slavery once enforced through law. My unusual intelligence allowed me to navigate free society with partial success, finding work that utilized my capabilities, despite racial barriers. But most freed people will not have such advantages. They will face freedom without resources, without education, without protection from those who view their liberty as threat rather than justice. The celebration of emancipation must be tempered by recognition of how much remains unchanged when legal status shifts but social structures persist. The observation proved painfully accurate as the war ended and Reconstruction began. Solomon watched as freed people throughout the South encountered exactly the barriers he'd predicted. Legal freedom, circumscribed by economic dependency. Political rights undermined by violence and intimidation. Theoretical equality contradicted by systematic exclusion from opportunities that would make that equality meaningful. His own circumstances improved somewhat during Reconstruction, with slavery abolished and racial attitudes shifting slightly in some northern communities. Solomon found opportunities to work more openly as a consultant and analyst. He provided services to businesses, lawyers, and government officials who needed complex calculations, data analysis, or problem solving that his unusual capabilities could address. He earned decent income, lived comfortably, and established a reputation within certain circles as someone who could solve seemingly impossible problems. But the fundamental contradiction never resolved. His intelligence was acknowledged only when useful, denied or minimized when convenient, treated as an exceptional aberration rather than evidence that black intellectual capability had been systematically suppressed rather than naturally absent. White society could accept Solomon as a unique individual while maintaining general beliefs about racial hierarchy, could utilize his abilities while denying the implications those abilities had for understanding race, intelligence, and human potential. In 1868, Solomon received a letter from an unexpected source. The handwriting was shaky, the paper expensive but stained, and the signature read, James Blackwood. Blackwood was writing from Galveston, where he'd lived in modest circumstances since losing Oleander Plantation. The letter expressed a desire to know what had become of Solomon, acknowledged ongoing guilt about the incomplete nature of his attempted emancipation, and reflected on how Solomon's presence had permanently altered his understanding of slavery, race, and American society. Solomon responded with a letter that historians consider one of his most significant pieces of writing. The letter, now held by the Smithsonian Institution, reads in part, Mr. Blackwood, your letter reached me in Cincinnati, where I have established a life that is materially comfortable but psychologically complex. I am grateful you wrote, as I have often thought about you and wondered what became of your attempt to act on moral convictions that contradicted your society's expectations. You express guilt about freeing one man while keeping others enslaved, about the incomplete nature of your gradual emancipation plan and its ultimate failure. I want to address that guilt directly. What you attempted at Oleander was imperfect, compromised by circumstance, limited by your own capacity to sacrifice everything for principle. But it was also genuine, costly, and significant. You recognized truth that most slaveholders spent their lives denying, and you acted on that recognition despite knowing the consequences. That matters, even though it didn't achieve the systematic change the situation demanded. I have come to understand that moral action within immoral systems rarely achieves perfection. We do what we can with the courage and resources available to us, recognizing that our actions are inadequate, while also recognizing that inaction is worse. You freed me. That act changed my life completely. Gave me possibilities I would never have had otherwise. The fact that you couldn't free everyone doesn't diminish what that freedom meant to me. You attempted broader emancipation and were destroyed for that attempt. The destruction itself demonstrates why such attempts were rare. Most people choose comfortable complicity over costly resistance. You chose differently and paid the price for that choice. Perhaps the more important question is not whether your actions solved the problem, but what your actions revealed about the problem itself. You freed me because my intelligence made slavery's injustice unavoidable for you. But what about those whose intelligence was less obvious, less measurable, less demonstrable through calculations and languages and perfect memory? Were they less deserving of freedom, less fully human? The answer, obviously, is no. Yet you could not extend to them the recognition you extended to me, could not see in them the same undeniable humanity you saw in my exceptional capabilities. This limitation wasn't personal failing. It was systemic failure built into how slavery trained owners to perceive enslaved people. Exceptional cases like mine could break through that trained perception. Ordinary humanity, unremarkable intelligence, common human dignity. These things remained invisible, deniable, insufficient to override the system's requirements. What slavery's end must ultimately accomplish is not just freeing exceptional individuals like myself, but recognizing that exceptionalism should never have been required for freedom in the first place. Every person deserves liberty, dignity, and full recognition of their humanity, regardless of whether their capabilities exceed, match, or fall short of whatever standards society might apply. Until that recognition becomes universal rather than selective, until freedom depends on being human rather than being exceptional, the fundamental problem remains unresolved. You helped me see this truth, Mr. Blackwood, though perhaps not in the way you intended. Your discomfort around me, your ultimate inability to extend your recognition of my humanity to others who were less obviously remarkable, revealed the limitation of individual moral awakening as a solution to systemic evil. Change requires more than scattered instances of conscience overriding convenience. It requires transformation of the entire structure that makes such conscience rare and costly rather than common and rewarded. I do not know if such transformation is possible. I have lived long enough in freedom to understand how deeply racial prejudice persists even after slavery's legal end, how thoroughly white society resists recognizing black humanity beyond narrow conditional terms. But I also know that change, however incomplete, matters. You changed me by freeing me. I perhaps changed you by forcing recognition you couldn't comfortably deny. Those changes ripple outward, in ways we cannot fully predict or measure. May you find peace with what you attempted and what you could not achieve. May we both continue working toward a society where intelligence is not required for freedom, where humanity alone is sufficient for dignity, where no one must be exceptional to deserve justice. With respect and gratitude, Solomon. The correspondence between Solomon and Blackwood continued sporadically until Blackwood's death in 1873. The letters revealed two men grappling with the legacy of their encounter, trying to understand what it meant that Solomon's intelligence had triggered Blackwood's moral crisis, what it revealed about slavery and race and American society, what possibilities existed for change within structures designed to resist transformation. Solomon lived until 1896, dying in Cincinnati at approximately 69 years of age. His obituary in the local newspaper, brief and perfunctory, identified him only as Solomon Freeman, Negro resident, employed in various business capacities, unmarried, survived by no immediate family. The obituary made no mention of his extraordinary intelligence, his contributions to Union war efforts, his work with the Underground Railroad, his writings on slavery and freedom, or his role in triggering James Blackwood's attempted emancipation at Oleander Plantation. This invisibility in death mirrored the invisibility he'd experienced in freedom. Despite capabilities that exceeded most people he encountered, despite contributions that had genuine historical significance, Solomon remained largely unknown. His existence documented, but his importance unrecognized by broader society. It wasn't until the late 20th century when historians began examining personal papers, letters, and obscure archives that Solomon's story emerged and his significance became apparent. The question his life poses remains powerfully relevant. What does it mean that someone of extraordinary intelligence had to be freed because his capabilities made slavery's injustice undeniable? Yet millions of people with ordinary intelligence remained enslaved because their common humanity proved insufficient justification for their liberation. What does it reveal about American society that Solomon's exceptionalism was required for him to be recognized as deserving freedom, that his unusual capabilities, rather than his basic humanity, gave the grounds for acknowledging his right to liberty? These questions point to the fundamental problem Solomon identified in his writings. Freedom and dignity and justice should not depend on being exceptional. There should be universal rights granted to every human being, regardless of capability, regardless of intelligence, regardless of whether someone can perform calculations faster than trained engineers, or speak 7 languages, or remember everything they encounter. The fact that Solomon's extraordinary intelligence was necessary for Blackwood to recognize his humanity reveals how thoroughly slavery had corrupted the moral sensibilities of who participated in it. How completely it had trained them to deny the obvious humanity of people they enslaved. In 1882, a historian named Rebecca Hayes interviewed Solomon for a project documenting the experiences of freed slaves during and after the Civil War. The interview, preserved in the Hayes collection at Howard University, includes a section where Solomon reflected on his own legacy and what he hoped his story might contribute to understanding slavery and its aftermath. I am aware that my life is unusual, that my capabilities are extraordinary, that my experiences do not represent the typical slave narrative. But I hope that my story can serve a purpose beyond documenting individual exceptionalism. I hope it can illuminate the fundamental injustice of requiring exceptionalism for recognition of humanity. Every person I knew in slavery was fully human, deserving of freedom and dignity, regardless of whether their intelligence exceeded normal ranges or fell within them. The fact that I needed to be extraordinarily intelligent for my owner to recognize my right to freedom reveals the depth of moral corruption slavery created. It should not have required exceptional capability for me to deserve liberty. My humanity alone should have been sufficient, and the same applies to every person held in bondage, every person denied education and opportunity and recognition of their basic human worth. If my story serves any purpose, I hope it is this: to make visible the arbitrary nature of the judgment slavery required, to demonstrate that intelligence and capability exist independently of race, to show that the hierarchies American society constructed had no natural or moral foundation. I was not freed because of some essential difference between myself and others who remained enslaved. I was freed because one particular owner could not maintain comfortable self-deception when confronted with undeniable evidence of my intellectual equality or superiority. That evidence should never have been necessary. But since it was necessary for that particular situation, perhaps its documentation can contribute to broader recognition that the entire system was built on lies that crumbled when examined honestly. The examination Solomon called for continues today. Historians studying slavery increasingly recognize that the system required systematic denial of enslaved people's full humanity, that this denial was maintained through violence, law custom, and willful ignorance, and that the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people were suppressed rather than absent. Solomon's story provides dramatic evidence of this suppression, shows what one person could achieve when given access to education and opportunity, and invites us to imagine what millions of others might have achieved if the system that enslaved them had not deliberately prevented their development. The auction ledger from December 7, 1859, still exists in the Rosenberg Library archives, Lot 43. Solomon sold for $400, below market value because his intelligence frightened potential buyers, because his capabilities threatened the comfortable fiction slavery required, because his existence posed questions that antebellum Texas society could not comfortably answer. That ledger entry represents more than one man's sale. It represents the systematic denial of human potential that slavery enacted every single day. The suppression of intelligence and capability and creativity and ambition in millions of people whose contributions were stolen, whose possibilities were deliberately destroyed, whose humanity was denied, so that others could profit from their forced labor. James Blackwood's attempt to act on moral convictions triggered by Solomon's intelligence, failed. The plantation was lost. The gradual emancipation plan collapsed. The workers were re-enslaved under new ownership. But the attempt mattered, because it demonstrated that recognition was possible, that the lies could be pierced, that even someone deeply invested in slavery's continuation could have their certainties shattered by undeniable evidence of what they'd been denying. Blackwood paid for that recognition with everything he'd built. Most slaveholders chose differently, chose comfortable ignorance over costly honesty. But the fact that Blackwood chose recognition, however imperfect and incomplete, proves that the choice existed. What would have happened if more slaveholders had made similar choices? What if Solomon's intelligence had triggered not isolated instances of individual manumission, but systematic recognition that the entire structure was indefensible? These questions can't be answered because history followed different paths. But they illuminate what was possible, what was prevented, what might have been if moral courage had been more common than it proved to be. The mystery isn't really about Solomon's intelligence, though that remains remarkable and somewhat inexplicable even today. The mystery is about how American society responded to that intelligence, how it required such extraordinary capability before acknowledging humanity, how it structured itself to suppress and deny what Solomon represented. The mystery is about the psychological mechanisms that allowed slavery to persist despite countless daily encounters with enslaved people's full humanity, about the systematic blindness that made such persistence possible, about the rare moments when that blindness cracked and truth became unavoidable. Stories like Solomon's remind us that history is full of buried narratives, forgotten individuals whose experiences challenge official accounts and comfortable assumptions. Here at the Sealed Room, we specialize in uncovering exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that institutions tried to erase, the ones that complicate simple narratives, the ones that force us to reconsider what we thought we knew about American history. Because understanding the past accurately requires confronting its full complexity, including the parts that make us uncomfortable, including the contradictions that reveal how thoroughly injustice shaped the society we inherited. The impossible mystery of the most intelligent male slave ever traded in Galveston wasn't about whether his intelligence was real. The evidence from multiple independent sources confirms that Solomon possessed cognitive capabilities that exceeded normal human ranges, that his memory and analytical abilities were genuinely extraordinary. The mystery is about what that intelligence revealed about slavery itself, about the fragility of the justifications that supported it, about the psychological costs of maintaining a system that required systematic denial of obvious truths. Solomon's life after slavery showed that freedom alone didn't solve the problems his intelligence posed. Even in liberty, even in the North, even after emancipation, his capabilities remained threatening to a society structured around racial hierarchies. He had to hide his contributions, accept invisibility, work through proxies who would receive credit for analysis he performed. The legal circumstances changed when he gained freedom, but the fundamental problem persisted. American society wasn't prepared to acknowledge that intelligence had nothing to do with race, that the hierarchies it had constructed lacked any natural foundation, that people like Solomon had existed all along, their potential suppressed rather than absent. What do you think about this story? Does extraordinary intelligence prove anything about slavery's injustice? Or should ordinary humanity have been sufficient? What does it mean that Solomon had to be exceptional to earn recognition that should have been universal? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear how these buried stories resonate with you. what questions they raise, what connections you see to ongoing struggles for recognition and justice. If this story challenged your understanding of American history, if it revealed complexities you hadn't encountered before, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the stories we uncover here. The ones that institutions tried to bury, the ones that challenge official narratives and force us to reckon with difficult truths. Turn on notifications because history, this important, deserves to be remembered, discussed, and understood in all its uncomfortable complexity. Solomon walked away from Galveston in December 1859, carrying manumission papers and 50, beginning a journey that would take him from slavery to freedom, from Texas to Cincinnati, from invisibility to partial recognition. He lived 57 years in freedom, contributing to the Union war effort, helping fugitive slaves escape north, working as a consultant and analyst for those willing to acknowledge his capabilities. He died largely unknown, his obituary brief and unremarkable, his extraordinary story unrecognized by the society he'd lived in. But he left behind writings that document his experience, letters that reveal his insights, and a historical record that proves what he represented, someone whose intelligence was so extraordinary it couldn't be denied, even by those most invested in denying black humanity. Someone whose mere existence threatened the entire structure of justification slavery required. Someone who proved that the supposed natural order was a fiction maintained through systematic suppression of human potential, rather than an accurate reflection of natural capabilities. The ledger entry from December 7, 1859 remains in the archives, lot 43 of 400, below market value, because what he represented was too threatening for most buyers to accept. That entry is more than a transaction record. It's evidence of the impossible position Solomon occupied. Too intelligent to be comfortable property, too black to be fully recognized as human in 1859 Texas. His story challenges us to imagine a history where intelligence like his was not an anomaly requiring special explanation, but simply part of the full range of human capability, present in all populations, suppressed in some and celebrated in others based on power rather than nature. Until next time, keep questioning the official stories. Keep seeking the buried truths. Keep remembering that history is more complex than any simple narrative can capture.